Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet in our new Q&A edition, answering the questions that we get from you, our readers and our listeners. To ask a question, just hit us up on social media or shoot us an email at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. John,
Did you
we've got
just
a
say
lot.
hit us up? I think you just said hit us
Did I,
up.
did
Is
I
that
say
right?
hit us up?
You
I've
said
spent.
hit us up on social media. That's pretty great
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah. It's a boomer. It's not a boomer phrase. It's a Gen X phrase. And I've spent enough time around you that I've picked up that kind of stuff.
I am a proud Gen Xer. Actually, I'm not. There's nothing. Gen Xers, people spend a lot of time talking about the difference between generations, and it's really this boomer versus millennial sort of thing. But then in the middle are Gen Xers. And I'm not sure we've ever contributed a single thing to the good of the world. Have we? I'm trying to think what it is. Michael Jordan, maybe.
well, you
Would
guys
be
gave us Nickelback. And
that's
and
that's
every
all the reason to there was a book written years ago, Shane, and I'm not making this up. It was one of those kind of cool Christian authors back in previous generations that wrote literally a book that said Gen X will save the world. And it was just the most ridiculous argument ever, and observably not true. Yeah, I mean, it was hard that somebody actually put that book proposal together and a publisher actually was like, this could work. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out that whole process because the thesis itself is really indefensible. And I say that as a Gen
Generation
Xer.
Shrek is not going to save the world. I call it Generation Shrek because
Generation Shrek,
every joke
yeah.
in Shrek, every pop culture reference comes from Gen
It's
X.
for us. That's right. It's for us. Actually, we did have some good jokes. That's true. There was some. I think we were like the early generation to really do sarcasm well, and millennials have kind of taken it too far.
We'll keep taking credit for it, John, on behalf of your whole generation. Well done.
It's true. It's good. There's a good bit of snarkiness in this, but that actually just says A, we had too much time on our hands, and B, we were raised as one author. Actually, there's a remarkable article years ago. We should actually link to this so we can find it, about Generation X and first things. The author was a theologian named Sarah Hinlicky Wilson. And she says something there about, short historical memories and being raised by the VCR. And almost everything can be explained about Gen X and between those two things, short historical memories and we were raised by the VCR.
Well, I wonder where Gen X fits into some of our questions today, because there's a mood that I sense reflected in many of these questions, and it's a mood of paralysis among many Christians. We're wondering, we want to do something. Our listeners and readers want to do something about the things they see in the news, on the headlines, on their social media feeds, and yet they're not sure exactly what to do. And there's a lot of confusing messages coming at them about how to address cultural challenges. And of course, millennials are stereotypically on the vanguard of the progressive push in our society, and then the boomers are stereotypically, excuse me, the boomers are stereotypically on the back end of things, sort of shouting no and telling everyone to get off their porch, and sharing questionable memes of questionable provenance and authenticity on social media. But yeah, the Gen Xers, where are they in that picture? I'll tell you what, John, there's a question. The first question that I want to tackle here goes right to the heart of an issue that I think Christians of all generations are deeply concerned about as we come into this election, and as we confront every political choice, really. And that's one of the prime motivators of our activism and our voting and our involvement in politics, and that is the abortion issue, the pro-life issue. And a reader writes in with a word of praise and then a big question here. This reader says, John, thank you for all you do. We're leaving our church, and the pastors, youth, and executives sent me an article from David French, his latest post about blood on our hands if you don't vote for Trump. And of course, just to give some background, French argues that's fallacious. Someone who doesn't vote for Trump does not have blood on their hands, baby's blood on their hands. That's the charge that often is leveled at him. And this reader continues, I'm sure you've seen it. Will you be covering this anytime soon? I'd love to hear your perspective on his article, as our church has certainly turned progressive in the last 6 months, and BreakPoint and World have kept me grounded. I was caught off guard with this article, and it felt like our pastors were stoking the fire to show me that even conservative Christians can explain that we don't really need to pay attention to which administration is in office, as if it really doesn't matter. I'd appreciate any of your comments or thoughts.
Well, yeah, this is, I think, where a lot of people find themselves, because you've got two very, very loud factions right now in evangelical circles when it comes to this election. And one is convinced that, that a presidential candidate can be a savior, and the other one is convinced that a presidential candidate can be an antichrist. And neither one of those things are true. And I think what's happening is at times folks are using this kind of noise and the conflict and the fact that neither side is right, and assuming that Donald Trump or Joe Biden is either the savior or the antichrist, then to basically say then we shouldn't care about politics and it doesn't matter. It is observably and factually not true that who is in office and what administration more specific is in office, that it matters. It clearly matters. It matters on all kinds of things. It matters on where federal funds are going. It matters on who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in kind of American culture. It matters just looking at the difference between the current folks that are working in the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. So, and this isn't, and none of these things are actually what the president or the presidential candidate themselves bring to the table. It's who else they bring to the table. So to suggest that it actually doesn't matter, which I do think that there are a lot of people that are very frustrated with the anger and the vitriol and the noise, and especially I think, Shane, the hyperbole, then use this as an excuse to say, look, it's really just not that important. It does matter. Elections do have consequences, and there's a number of ways that it does, and I think that maybe the best way to answer this particular question is to back up and to actually talk about what is a Christian responsibility to politics. We have a number of videos coming up in our What Would You Say series. If you don't know about that, whatwouldyousay.org, you can find it, you can subscribe to it, or go to the YouTube channel and look up What Would You Say. The first result will be a Dave Matthews music video, and then after that, you can find our animated features, which really very specifically answer a single question. And these are some of the questions that are answered, and they'll be coming out in the coming weeks. But I want to walk through those, like why Christians should care and be involved in politics. And in other words, and this kind of, I guess, goes to something, Shane, we've been talking a lot about internally on our team, and that when it's a time of chaos, we have to go back to fundamentally what is true. Otherwise, we're just kind of playing cultural whack-a-mole. And look, I wasn't a big fan of this particular article by David French. I know what he was trying to say. David's a good guy, and he's a really good thinker, and I do appreciate his take, even though I don't always agree with it. But I don't want to play cultural whack-a-mole, like where I want to whack down this article or disagree with that one. Because oftentimes when you do that, then it's kind of taken in the Twitter sphere or the blogosphere or the online mob as kind of being in an all-out attack. We've lost kind of the space to disagree on this and agree on that. I don't want to be that kind of voice. So I think it's probably most helpful for us to back up and say, look, what does a Christian responsibility to politics look like? But I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to let you jump in before I actually go back and try to walk through 4 or 5 things that I think are really important.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. The first thing that I would say is that David French doesn't think the president doesn't matter on this issue. No, I've never heard him say that, never seen him write that. The article in question was about how much the president matters and how much impact he or she can really have on the abortion issue. And his case was that this issue is really has much more to do with culture and local politics than we often like to think. And that the president and the Supreme Court, on balance, have been stabilizing influences on behalf of Roe v. Wade and abortion jurisprudence, not really a threat to it in the last 40 some odd years. So that was a good point. That was well taken. And then he, of course, also delved into the information in that new Notre Dame study that dug into Americans' actual attitudes on abortion, and reminded us that it's not really, for the majority of Americans, abortion is not really the kind of issue that it is for the extreme poles. So the hardcore pro-lifers and the hardcore pro-abortion crowd. We think in terms of legality and black and white morality. For the majority of Americans, it's a very mixed up and confused question of circumstances and who's and what's and how's and you know, how far along the baby is and things like this. And that's a mixed up way of thinking about it. I think I believe that if we were to actually cross-examine that, it would fall apart pretty quickly. But that is how most people think about abortion. They don't like it, number one, and they and the majority of Americans still think it should be legal in some capacity. So that's the point I think that he was trying to establish. And the background for French was one that I've experienced as well too, as a fairly vocal critic of President Trump. Not necessarily his policies on this issue, but more his general demeanor and character and attitude and just the kind of person he is. And French has been in the same place. And when I've brought up those objections, I often get this retort that, well, none of this matters because babies. And if you don't sort of get in line, then you've got baby's blood on your hands. And I would just say that strikes me as an awfully odd follow-up to the idea that I heard so often from Christians that, well, I have to vote for this guy because it's an agonized choice, right? I have no other choice. This is what's been given me. Fine, I can understand that. I can totally understand that stance. I don't understand saying that and then turning around and saying, well, if you don't make the same choice, then X, you know, you have committed some grave crime.
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to say at the beginning, is this kind of extremist language on both sides. I mean, there's plenty of times that critics of the president, including David French, I think, have often, you know, said things like, look, I understand the agonized choice, but I'm not, you know, I don't understand the kind of the all out support, and as if there's nothing wrong with this character and as if there's nothing here to be dealt with.
Yeah.
And then to turn around in the next breath and oftentimes give the impression that there's no moral way to vote for the president when people are walking agonized in states, and, you know, realizing that to nod is a vote for the other side. So that's exactly the problem that I'm trying to point out, is at one level, we have never Trumpers that give the impression that the world will be ruined if Trump has another term, and is being ruined right now. And then there's the pro-Trumpers that basically say that the world would be ruined if he's not in office. He's the only one that can do the job. The reality is, and I do think David was trying to say this in this particular piece at some level, it's just sometimes hard to navigate between the way this language comes across in other context. But the presidential race is very important, and it's not as important as we think it is. And both of those things are true somehow. And so that's why I think at some level we've got to back up and say, look, why should we vote at all? Because again, this is being used, and even sometimes by pastors, to discourage political involvement whatsoever, or to justify Christians, you know, staying home and not jumping in. And I don't think that that's an option. And here's 4 reasons that I think voting is kind of the first step in someone's Christian responsibility. The first thing is that the Bible's really clear that sin is not just the bad things you do, it's the good things you fail to do. And if there's an opportunity to do any good with voting, then that's something we should be involved in. The second thing is that on a theological level, Paul talks so much about rendering to, you know, basically kind of trying to give a take of what Jesus said, rendering to Caesar, you know, giving the authorities their due and that sort of stuff. Now, of course, in his culture, that meant dealing with some awful dictators and people that were actually going to maybe even persecute the church. In our context, though, the authority has been given to us. Like there's a participation to the government. So rendering to the authority what is due is actually rendering to ourselves the influence that we can actually have. It's that incredible line from, you know, the Patriot, when they're trying to figure out whether South Carolina is going to go to the join the revolution or not. And Mel Gibson says, why would I trade a king 1,000 miles away for 1,000 king 1 mile away? And it's an interesting question, but the fact is that's what we did. We actually did. We traded that. We are 1,000 kings 1 mile away. And so there's a level of responsibility, I think, there. I think a much more tangible one is as we've said, is that policy really matters. Policies, that force the integration of restrooms for schools affects real people, including children. Policies that
By
try
that
to
you
help.
mean you're talking about men's and women's restrooms being combined.
Integrated.
You're not
Yeah,
going
no,
back to
that's
the
right.
60s and talking about racial integration.
Oh,
Okay.
right. I mean, gender integration. Yeah,
Right.
sorry.
Right.
That really matters. But then going back, policy that forced the integration of schools, that really mattered for people. Policy can bless people and policy can harm people. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. Policies are ideas applied.
Hmm.
And so if that's the case, then policy is a way to love our neighbor. And so that also brings up one of the really tangible things when it comes to participating in an election. Nearly all the attention is on who's at the top of the ticket, who's running for president, and what that administration is. All the really important things happening with the religious freedom right now are far more local than what's happening in the White House. It has to do with unelected civil rights commissions that are appointed by locally elected officials. So
That's why Jack Phillips ended up at the Supreme Court, because of an unelected civil rights commission in Colorado.
right. And that proves two things that are simultaneously true. Presidential elections matter because that has a lot to do with who's in the Supreme Court that they're facing. And local politics matter because it determines who gets there in the first place. And we focus so much on, the top of the ticket. There's so many important things. The ballot initiatives in the 2016 election, when you get past all the noise and the rhetoric and the heated stuff and all that, the ballot initiatives on a state level, one could really argue, had as much impact as who's in the White House right now. When you look at what happened in Colorado, you look at what happened in Florida, you look at what happened in Arizona. And by the way, there's a whole lot of states with a whole lot of ballot initiatives that are live. Good heavens, who's on the school board? I mean, sometimes who's on the school board is determined by hundreds of votes, not thousands of votes, hundreds of votes. And that determines curriculum. That determines priorities. That determines, how people are, the sort of freedom that teachers have and the sort of freedom that parents have and the access they have to their kids. I mean, this is enormously important in the long term. And so that's why I think that using the chaos that is currently observable at the presidential election to drive believers to stay out of the political process is a dereliction of duty. The good that we can do, the vote that we can give, the way that we can try to love our neighbor. And if you don't, then you're irrelevant. I mean, then we got to stop complaining. And so the spirit of the question, if I'm reading it right, had less to do with the actual content of the article. Although, as I said, I know what David was trying to say there, and I partially agree and have some qualms with it. But the real spirit of the question to me is using that sort of thing to encourage people to political inaction. And I just think that's fundamentally a wrong way to help people engage this cultural moment.
Okay, so we have another question that's very relevant to this. It's almost the natural follow-up question. And this reader asks, reversing Roe v. Wade would still legally allow abortions in some states. Shouldn't our intent be to make abortion illegal once and for all in every state with a life amendment to the U.S. Constitution? Amendment 13 making slavery illegal and 19 giving women the right to vote weren't easy to pass, but were absolutely necessary. What would be God's choice? So how do we actually deal with the issue on a federal level here, or do we?
Oh, give me a legal personhood amendment any day of the week. Of course. The question is between A, which is where we're at, and that might be somewhere around P or Q or R. There's a whole lot of other steps. Now, sometimes you can jump steps, right? So, for example, making slavery illegal, that happened at the state level with some states and not at the federal level. But it wouldn't have jumped from 0 to 60 without it happening, first of all, at the state level, and the strength growing in states like Pennsylvania and other places, putting pressure and coming up with new ways to do commerce, as opposed to how the South was, doing what they were doing. There's this incredible line. My kids love Hamilton the musical, and there's this great scene where Alexander Hamilton is debating Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson saying, "We don't want to pay for the revolution, and we've got it made in the shade down south." And Hamilton's like, "Yeah, we really know what's happening down south and who's doing the planting," that sort of thing. In other words, there was a state level. A whole lot of state level work that even paved the way for the Amendment 13 to even make any sort of progress whatsoever. And that's all I'm saying is, give me less abortions until we can have no abortions. And it's just the incremental strategy. Not everyone agrees with it. I understand it, but I think, again, we should do the good that we can do. And yeah, I think God's choice, I don't know if it would be this specific amendment or any specific amendment, other than it would be probably a culture that wouldn't even imagine that abortion is something that should ever be done, like at one point we had. So I agree that should be the intent. How to get to that conclusion is a process.
Yeah, you have to think of it in terms of bars to clear, right? In a track and field setting, the bar of setting state level restrictions on abortion, or of changing individual minds, or of perhaps restricting it in some other way along the way, either through lower courts or whatever. Those are low bars to clear. Those are easier to clear. The bar of amending the U.S. Constitution is probably the highest one there is, and that's going to require just an enormous exertion of energy and probably a cultural will that doesn't exist at this point. And so that tells me that the work needs to be done upstream of that still. There needs to be work done on the cultural front, where we convince people, we change hearts and minds, as I think it was George W. Bush who put it that way. And then we also have to focus on state level restrictions that are going to allow policies, not just restrictions, I should say, but policies in general that are going to affirm life and make it possible and easy to choose life. So, those state level restrictions have a natural way of percolating up to the federal level, because as soon as those restrictions are put in place, somebody's going to challenge the constitutionality of them, and that's going to start bombarding the Supreme Court, which now is theoretically more conservative on this issue than it has been for a long time. So I don't have a whole lot of hope for the court, overturning Roe v. Wade in one big dramatic case, but I do know that bombarding the court with challenges to the decision and to all the other decisions propping up abortion is a viable strategy for chipping away at it over time. But ultimately, I do think it does come back to that cultural change. There needs to be a very robust pro-life apologetic push that helps people to understand the case in a very simple, succinct, and powerful way, and then to be committed to preserving life at its earliest stages.
Which is a great opportunity to let everyone know about our next short course, which starts next week, which is an incredible way to actually learn that with our friend Scott Klusendorf, one of the great trainers of pro-life apologetics that exist. 4 weeks, every Tuesday night in the evening. You can join live. If you have to miss a live session, then you can actually get a link to the video, so you won't miss any of the teaching. Week 1 is how to make a case for the humanity of the unborn to be protected in less than a minute. Week 2 is the bad ways we talk about abortion. Week 3, how to answer common pro-choice objections. And week 4, how to start and join the cause. Like, what's the plan? How do you do the next thing? Next 4 weeks, beginning next Tuesday night. What is that? The 8th, I think, is that next Tuesday night, Shane? I think that's the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, 29th.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so just come to breakpoint.org and we'll link you to that at our next Colson Center short course.
Well, these questions seem to just flow into each other, and there's one more question I want to get to here that that really just follows naturally from what we just addressed. And this was by someone in response to the Osgenis prayer webinar that we held recently. This person writes, "From what I read, Jesus did not bother himself with Rome. He bothered himself with people. What, if anything, does that say about where our focus needs to be placed in our culture? Not saying it's an either or situation, but society reflects the hearts of people. If hearts are changed, becoming Jesus followers, it would stand to reason that society will change. Have we exchanged our target of influencing through the heart for issues targeting morality?" And I suppose the question also naturally asks questions targeting legality.
Yeah, this question is a good one to think through, especially because it speaks to both kind of what our responsibility is in this political moment, but it also speaks to how we understand the life and the work of Jesus, right? So in Jesus's day, there were all kinds of authorities and governmental forces, political forces. One was Rome, right? And he didn't really have much access there. Now, when Paul later on actually has a chance to go to Rome, he does try to engage Rome. He actually does talk to people who are involved in the government. People are becoming Christians in Caesar's household. He actually appeals to his citizenship as a way to secure his rights so that he can actually go and share the gospel with the emperor. So Paul's going to do this a little bit different than Jesus did it. And the reason is just because Paul has access to Rome. And for the mission that God put Jesus on, he didn't send him to Rome. Jesus stayed in Galilee. Secondly, there was a government or a political structure in the context of Israel that had to do with the church hierarchy, Sadducees and Pharisees and so on. And you can't read 4 verses into any of the New Testament Gospels without watching Jesus directly try to engage not only individual teachers of the law, but the system itself. He literally flips over the tables in the temple. Now, this isn't the same thing as running for office, but it is the same
What did
thing
Michael
as
Scott say? My, how the turntables.
But this is a remarkable thing because it does show that Jesus did go after systems. He very much went after systems as well as individuals. It's not a choice. Third, if anyone thinks part of this is the difference between the means and the ends, or short-term wins versus long-term wins as far as the advance of the kingdom. And I do think that there's a fundamental back-to-front way of misthinking. And I can think of a couple people who email me frequently, with concerns about how we talk about politics or someone. And I appreciate their emails, but it's missing the fact that politics is a means to an end, not the end. And a lot of time when we hear, what happens in the next election or what happens with this policy or how bad this other person is, it's treated as, well, the reason we share the gospel is so ultimately we can have power in the White House. I actually heard somebody talk about that the other day, that, the outcome of, for example, having, X number of people have a biblical worldview would be, we would have enormous political influence. Listen, we should influence politics, not as the end, but as a means so that we can further protect the vulnerable, B, advance what's true and good, and C, ultimately create elbow room so that the church can be the church and disciple people to follow God, through Jesus Christ. And so it's a question of means and ends here that people often get. And I know that that's the spirit behind the question. By the way, an undercurrent in this particular question has to do with, well, if Jesus did it, then we should do it, and if he didn't do it, and that's kind of what's called a red letter approach to the Bible. And look, Jesus is someone we should know everything that he did, and we should follow him. That's the whole point. But Jesus himself came as part of the history of Israel. Jesus himself came to build his church, he said. So the church went beyond him, was the tangible expression of Christ in the world. And so we have to also look at what happens in the rest of Scripture. And what is condemned, what is affirmed. It's not just directly what Jesus said. It's like when people say, well, Jesus never talked about same-sex marriage. Well, of course he didn't, because no one in history talked about same-sex marriage until about the 1940s, right? I mean, no one even imagined that it was something to think about. The fact that Jesus didn't talk about it just is the same reason Jesus never talked about nuclear physics, right? I mean, it would have been a kind of a crazy thing for him
nuclear war. For that
or nuclear war. So this gets also at least a little bit to how we read the Bible, how we understand the scripture.
Oh, it certainly does. I mean, the "what would Jesus do" phrase is well intended. The problem is that Jesus would die for the sins of the world. Jesus would ascend into the heavenly places and become our high priest on behalf of his church. It's not, we can't precisely follow Jesus in that wooden of a way, because he came for a purpose as an absolutely unique individual
I got to
whose
tell
life
you a
will
story
never be
about this. I
repeated.
have a great story about once I was moderating this online class. It was great. And when people were wrestling with their calling, and I would have students quote Jesus's words when he was in the temple, and he's quoting Isaiah, God has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. And then say, this is what God has anointed me to do. And I'd be like, wait a minute, that was a prophecy of Isaiah that Jesus appropriated for himself. Like, you're not allowed to take that. Jesus took that, right? Jesus is talking about himself, man, and they would get so mad. But it was like, no, this is a messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. Like, the Jewish people think this. They just think that Jesus misappropriated it. Jesus thought he was the fulfillment of this. He actually said, I'm quoting Isaiah right now. In fact, isn't that the passage where he says, he reads it, it's clearly a promise,
This
a
prophecy
messianic
is
promise.
fulfilled in your hearing.
He closes the scroll. I just did like this, like a book, but he closes the scroll.
Yeah.
And then he sits down, like, done. It's like an equivalent of a Jesus mic drop. And he sits down and says, this is me. I mean, it could not be more clear in the context of the passage. But we do have a tendency to do that, where we claim things that don't belong to us.
Yeah, and of course, what he did in his first coming is not necessarily the totality of what he will do, or of the example that he sets. I mean, he says, the Son of Man came to serve and not to be served. Well, he's going to be served for all eternity. He said he didn't come into the world to condemn it, but to save it. Well, he's coming back to condemn, the sins of the world. So it's absolutely a way of thinking through. It involves thinking through how we read the Bible, how we follow Jesus' example, and how we think about, politics and what the ideal world looks like. Jesus had a mission that was singular in his first coming, and he fulfilled that mission. What he did not do doesn't necessarily preclude us from participating in those processes. And politics exists. I'll say one more thing here, and then we got to close. Politics exists because there's injustice in the world, John. Ultimately, it's because it's God's means, according to Romans, of restraining evil and violence in the world, and of creating a system of justice and protections for the vulnerable. And coercion and force is necessary in response to coercion and force. So what we talk about with the issue that we spent most of the program on today, abortion, that's an attack on an innocent life. Someone who had no say in the matter is being exterminated for convenience sake or for whatever reason legally. That's an injustice. That's not what the government is designed to do. That's not its God-ordained purpose. And so we should participate in that coercive institution, precisely because this is an unjust world, one where evil exists and needs to be answered. And that's the most biblical response that I could think of to that question.
Well, I got to quibble with you on one point, which is, and I don't think you said this, but I think it sounded like you said this, which is that politics is kind of a result of the fall. I would agree maybe politics is, but it's important. Sometimes Christians think that government is the result of the fall. Like if humans had never fallen, then we would never have a government. Government is a necessary part of human relationships, whether there's a fall or not, in order to manage and to secure good and secure order. So, for example, imagine a huge church parking lot on a Sunday morning, completely filled with cars with only one exit. And everyone sat around and said, no, you go first. Now you go first. No, you go first, right? You would never be able to go anywhere. And by the way, I owe that example to my friend Jeff Myers, who just used that the other night. And it's why it was front and center in my mind. No one's wrong. No one's sinning by not moving. Everyone's trying to be nice. But you actually need a cop there to go drive. You go forward, right? And if you could imagine, the command to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it is pre-fall. This is what they were supposed to do. Let's imagine there's no fall, and you've got people everywhere. You still got to, we probably would have Teslas way earlier than we do now, things like that. But somebody still has to go first, and you have to order society. And so I think that's a misnomer. I think that Christians make that mistake. We only see government as a necessary evil. Now, how political campaigns are run these days, that might be a necessary evil. But but politics itself, government itself, is a noble calling. It's a high calling. It's a vocation, like being a pastor, like being a teacher, or like being a mom and a dad and a grandparent and a businessman and everything else. If it's done, for the glory of God, to advance what's good, to advance what's true, protect people from what's wrong. Government has a role in the created order, not just in the fallen order.
Yeah, and maybe there's maybe what I mean there by government is the sword. Maybe that sword
That
will become
part of the
a
well, sure. I
plowshare
mean, since the fall, that's
eventually.
become it's not just a plowshare, right?
Right.
It's also
And let's not
a
forget
sword.
that in the closing chapter of Revelation, the throne features prominently there. There will be hierarchy, there will be government in the new creation, and the top dog, of course, will be Christ himself on the throne.
Yeah, somebody's always been in charge. It's not been us.
Well, folks, thanks so much for listening to the BreakPoint podcast and our Q&A session. These are a lot of fun for me and John. We'll be back next week answering more of your questions about worldview-related topics. Drop us a message on social media or email, or hit us up at Ask the Colson Center at colsoncenter.org, and we'd love to engage with your question. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.